But one figure of antiquity is remembered above all else for his ability to create one of the most powerful kingdoms of Britain during the Middle Ages. This is the legend and life of one of the most memorable Vikings in history, Cnut the Great. But how did this Danish native accomplish such a task, and how did he become king of England? Join us in this video to find out. Just before we begin, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Well over 1,000 years ago, the islands of Great Britain and Ireland were going through dramatic change. After the retreat of the Roman Empire in southern Britain, an enormous power vacuum was left behind, one which many groups tried to fill. While native Britons tried to pick up where the Romans left off, other indigenous peoples, such as the Picts and the tribes of the Old North, ruled their territories under a warrior aristocracy. Heavy raiding brought forth by the tribes of the North and even Irish pirates ultimately forced the Romanized Britons to seek help from Germanic-speaking mercenaries that originated in modern Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. But this would soon turn out to be a horrible mistake for the native Britons. After the Germanic peoples aided the Romanized natives in their wars against the Picts and northern tribes, the mercenaries decided to carve out a portion of the island for themselves, where they would become the sole rulers. This was the beginning of the Germanic kingdoms of Britain. Of the various groups that went on to colonize southern Britain, the most prevalent were the Saxons and the Anglos, the latter of which is where we derive the modern term English, and why we term this period to be the Anglo-Saxon era of England. By the 8th century, various kingdoms had arisen, including Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, all of which were ruled over by these Germanic-speaking peoples. While they somewhat considered themselves of the same origin, this didn't stop the Anglo-Saxons from going to war with one another in hopes of extending the borders of their kingdoms. Britain had now become a mishmash of numerous ethnic groups, many of whom sought to control the others. Great warriors arose in all parts of the island. The Britons had fond memories of the mysterious King Arthur, who emerged to push back the Anglos invaders. The Saxons sang the praises of their fierce and just ruler Alfred the Great. But one leader who stood out during the Middle Ages for his ability to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was the Viking warrior Cnut the Great. During the 10th century, the Anglican kingdom of Wessex managed to form alliances that enabled them to unify much of the English realms into one empire. One of the sole purposes of unification was to muster the strength to push back the devastating Viking invasions. But fast forward just 1 century later and we find Cnut, a Danish Viking, sitting on the throne of this unified English empire. Not only this, he was also king of Denmark and Norway, essentially ruling over a vast sway of territory on the shores of the North Sea. But how did the Viking warrior Cnut the Great come to take hold over Anglican power? First, we'll have to go back to the 9th century, to a time when Scandinavian Vikings had been raiding vast parts of the British Isles. During Viking expeditions around Europe and the Mediterranean, many chiefs decided to conquer small parts of various nations to call their own. This would aid the seafarers during longer journeys and give them somewhere safe to stop. By the 8th century, Scandinavian power had reached an all-time high. It was further emphasized thanks to the tales spreading around Europe centered on how terrifying and brutal the Vikings were. This played a prominent role in allowing the Vikings to conquer small coastal villages and towns with little effort. Things were going so well that a spurt of confidence led the King of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, to consider the idea of taking over the English throne. Forkbeard was a fearless warrior, leader, and son of the famous Viking king Harald Bluetooth. Forkbeard, alongside his son Cnut and their extensive army of Viking warriors, decided to sail to England and take over the throne. In 1013, Forkbeard's longships had reached the eastern coast of England, and soon the Vikings were decimating the southern and midland Anglo-Saxon territories. The Anglican ruler of the time, Ethelred, was not prepared for the might behind the invasion of these terrifying Viking warriors, and he was forced to flee to Normandy, where he could find refuge. The Anglican nobility of the era became so disillusioned with their king in exile that they acknowledged Sweyn Forkbeard as king. For the first time in history, a Viking was now the king of the Anglicans. Unfortunately, Forkbeard's rule would be short-lived, as the following year, the news would reach Denmark that their king was dead. This led to an enormous power vacuum in the kingship there, and divided the territories into 2 camps, those in favor of Forkbeard's son, Cnut ruling, and those in favor of the Anglican Ethelred. The latter was able to convince enough of the nobility of the Anglo-Saxon class to allow him to return and rule, and even promised to forgive those who had abandoned him during the initial Viking invasion. Ethelred then launched an attack on the Vikings upon returning from Normandy in hopes of reclaiming his throne, and his attempts were successful. Cnut and much of his Viking settlement were overwhelmed by the loss of their king and unprepared for Ethelred's invasion, forcing them to retreat to Denmark. Cnut realized that he needed a lot more manpower and time to organize an effective resistance if he wanted to have any chance of claiming back his father's throne. Upon his return to Denmark, he got right down to business. Immediately, Cnut began planning his return to Britain, and the following year, in 1015, with an army of almost 10,000 men, Cnut and his band of warriors traveled southwest on the North Sea. Once on the shores of Britain, they slowly began to conquer the Anglican country. After 14 long months of war, Cnut was victorious in most of his encounters against Ethelred and his son, Edmund Ironside. When Ethelred passed away in 1016, Edmund was made king in name. However, this wouldn't last long. After a few more decisive clashes, culminating with the Battle of Issanden, Cnut defeated Edmund once and for all. A peace treaty was later signed in which Cnut allowed the Anglicans to control Wessex, but the rest of England would now be under the rule of the Danish Vikings. Everything was going smoothly for Cnut and his Scandinavian colonists, and by the end of the year, they couldn't believe their luck. News would soon reach the Vikings that the Wessex king, Edmund, had passed away. Now, Cnut could incorporate the enormous territory of Wessex under his sovereignty and further expand his kingdom. By Christmas, he would have his official coronation and was now known as King of all England. Having finally achieved his dream of following in his father's footsteps, Cnut wasted no time and began making plans to further consolidate his power. The first step was to marry Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy. This gave him the allies of the powerful northwestern French kingdom. But he didn't stop there. Cnut would take drastic actions to ensure Ethelred's remaining son, Edwig, could not make a claim to the throne by having him killed. Cnut was now one of the most powerful men in the Western world. He began restructuring his military and organized a fleet of 40 ships to support the English defenses. Just a few years after becoming King of England, he would soon be called back to his native Denmark. His brother, King Harold III, had recently passed, and this allowed Cnut to claim the Danish throne for himself. Over the next decade, he was not shy about dealing with any threats to his reign. Many men were exiled, and those who posed a serious threat to his rule were killed. While ruthless during the beginning of his reign, over time, the king established a more stable government in which Anglican and Viking communities lived in peace. During this time, Cnut also became heavily involved with the Christian church, which ensured he was perceived by his people in a positive light. He promoted the religion of Christianity and even converted to the faith himself. Seen as a patron of his newfound faith, Cnut would soon become the first Viking leader to be acknowledged by the Pope as a Christian king. This led Cnut to embark on a holy pilgrimage to Rome, where he would witness the coronation of Henry III. Upon his return to England, Cnut went on to further extend his power by becoming the King of Norway, which meant he now ruled over a vast portion of the lands surrounding the North Sea. As the Danish-born Viking now reigned over England, Denmark, and Norway, he had successfully completed what his father once dreamed of. He ruled over a vast North Sea empire that was united by his governance. Cnut would go on to rule over his extended kingdom for another 7 years until he eventually passed away on the 12th of December, 1035. His son, Harthacnut, was named heir, and a considerable weight was placed on his shoulders, for his father left him with the responsibility of ruling over Scandinavia and ensuring England stayed under the sovereignty of his brother Henry. Yet, nearly all the Anglo-Saxon chronicles depict Harthacnut as an unworthy king who did nothing important while he ruled. And that's our video on how the Danish Viking Cnut became the first king of all England. What did you think about today's video? Did you know that Vikings once sat on the throne of England, and that Cnut the Great ruled over a territory that covered most of the North Sea? Let us know all your thoughts in the comments section below. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.